Mr. Secretary General, thank you for having us.
It's an enormous pleasure.
And thank you for taking the time, because since you're doing the most difficult job in the world, as the very first Secretary General said, and apparently it is and hasn't become any easier, or has it?
No, on the contrary. I think we live in a moment of very high tension globally. We see the Security Council paralyzed in relation to some of the most dramatic threats to peace in the world, which of course is a matter of enormous concern. For me, I have nothing else but good offices, and unfortunately in this situation it's very difficult to make these good offices prevail in the context of peace and security. So we have seen a multiplication of conflicts, a rise in tension. And at the same time, we have a number of very important challenges for the future in which it's necessary to mobilize the international community. Climate change, the impacts of new technologies, the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, how to make sure that those things that can be a fantastic, positive development for the world are not handled in a way that becomes a major risk for the future of humankind. So both the present situation and the challenges for the future makes the present moment a very exciting one, but at the same time putting a lot of requests for the UN to be able to be relevant.
It's a huge agenda. We are only days away from the European election, though. So how worried are you about the rise of populists, nationalists, right-wing parties all over Europe in so many countries?
I think that the most important contribution of Europe to world civilization was the Enlightenment and the values of the Enlightenment. And they have to do with tolerance, they have to do with the primacy of reason. So I am very worried to see that those values are being put into question. I must confess that decades ago I would take them for granted, and I would believe that they were deeply rooted in European societies. We know now that unfortunately we have seen a rise in populism, in xenophobia, in racism and in other forms of irrationality. I hope that Europe will stay firmly rooted in the values of enlightenment, and that independently of the complexity of the political situation here and there, the majority of the Europeans will remain faithful to what has been, and I repeat it because I strongly feel it, the most important European contribution to world civilization.
You are from Portugal, and Portugal is the only European country, I think, that doesn't seem to have the problem of a right-wing party on the rise. Can we learn from your country?
Well, I mean, one of the things that has dramatically impacted in the European societies was the lack of capacity of Europe as a whole to manage the problems of refugees and migration. And I remember I was High Commissioner for Refugees during the Syrian refugee crisis, how much Europe was totally unable to work together in solidarity to address what would be perfectly manageable if all the European countries were able to do it effectively together. Now, the good thing about Portugal is, I remember when I was in government 20 years ago, I think we created a national consensus on migration policies, and both the center-left and the center-right government have understood that a country with a fertility index of 1.3 needs migration. Mm-hmm. And when you need something, you better organize it. I always give the same example. My mother is 96 years old. My mother has always someone 24 hours for 24 hours taking care of her with some minor health care. When I visit my mother, I've never seen a Portuguese taking care of my mother. So migration is needed in Europe. And we need to, as I said, when something is needed, we need to organize it. And to organize it in Europe, we need to be together. We need to do it in a coordinated way. And I hope that Europeans will learn this lesson, and that the questions of false identity will be overcome. And this is probably something that we Portuguese are quite happy. We have been there for 8 centuries. We have been everywhere in the world. We have had people from all over the world that came also to my country, so we don't have these problems of identity. And I think we have understood, and this was a consensus within all political parties, that migration should not be a divisive issue in our society.
The spirit of multilateralism has been guiding you always, and you will receive the Karlspreis, the very prestigious European prize, for your commitment to multilateralism. So how is it to actually have to operate in a country where the president says, puts America first and totally rejects multilateralism?
I think this is the paradox of our times. We live with challenges that no country can solve alone. We live in a world that more and more needs multilateralism to address the global problems. Some people say, well, as the world is becoming more and more multipolar, maybe we don't need multilateral institutions because multipolarity in itself will create some equilibrium. It's totally wrong. If you remember Europe before the First World War, Europe was multipolar, but with the absence of multilateral institutions of governance, Europe went into the First World War. And that is what we need to avoid now. I mean, exactly because the world is becoming more multipolar, exactly because power relations are becoming less clear, we need multilateral institutions now more than ever. Unfortunately, this is also a world in which people have lost trust in political establishments, and also lost trust in international institutions. And I think our role here is to make people regain trust, to make the UN relevant for people, to address the problems that people feel, especially those that were left behind by the undoubtful progress that globalization and technological change have created for the world, but in which countries, regions, areas have indeed pay the price. And that is where we feel in the rust belts of this world how easy it is for populism to emerge, how easy it is for the xenophobia to emerge, for the rejection of everything that is different to emerge. And that is why we need to make a huge effort to prove that multilateralism is an answer, to prove our value for the people, to be able to respond to the people's needs, and to reestablish that trust that is essential for the world to work properly.
Do you think there's any hope that the American president will understand that?
I think that you need to look at the American society as a whole. If you take climate change, for instance, it is true that the policy of the government is not favorable of climate action. But when you see how the business community is reacting, how cities are reacting, several governors are reacting, the civil society is reacting, you see an enormous dynamism in the American society. I believe that the US is a democratic society, and I think that represents an enormous potential for the future, independently of the individual positions of this or that personality, this or that president.
Germany has been had the presidency of the Security Council and opened the curtains. That was largely a symbolic act, but when we look at the Security Council, it is, as you say, sometimes paralyzed. We see how the big veto powers block each other all the time. Alone for Syria, there were, I think, 13 vetoes on the Syrian issue of humanitarian rights. So it sometimes feels already like the Cold War again. So how hopeful are you that there will be more reason in the international cooperation?
At the present moment, the relations between the major powers, if you have the US, Russia, China, have never been as dysfunctional as they are. And so at the present moment, it's very difficult in the Security Council to, when we have a serious problem, a serious crisis, of course there are many areas of cooperation is possible, but when you have a serious crisis, be it in Syria, be it in relation to Iran or in relation to any other situation, it is practically impossible to have a consensus decision within the Council, and of course the vetoes allow for the Council to become paralyzed in many of these circumstances. This is of course a dramatic problem for us, because for the public in general, the UN is just one thing, and so people do not necessarily distinguish what is the Security Council from what is, for instance, the extraordinary humanitarian action of UNICEF or the World Food Programme or the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and the number of lives that are being rescued every day, everywhere in the world. And so we all pay the price for that situation of paralysis, and I hope that tension will be able to come down, and I hope that countries will be able to find a way to overcome the present deep divisions that exist, namely in relation to the biggest powers, be it in peace and security, be it in trade, be it in technology, as we are seeing today in a very dramatic way.
Right at this point, Iran has called you, the Security Council, and maybe even you personally, I don't know that, and asked for help in the negotiations and dialogue with the US. Can the United Nations, can you be the person to actually help them talk to each other?
No, our good offices are always available, but the good offices have one problem. For them to work, they need the will of the two parties. The situation today is very worrying. There is a rise in tension that is, of course, worrying. I felt that in the last few days things have calmed down a little bit. We have been appealing very strongly for the rhetoric to go down and for the tension to be controlled, because I think we need to avoid at all costs a war that would have unpredictable consequences for the region and for the world.
When it comes to Syria, your own undersecretary was really, really frustrated recently because he said, what are all the resolutions good for if the countries don't comply? Is there anything you can do to encourage them to actually stick to what they promised?
Well, we are doing it, we are trying, we are pushing, namely to try to create conditions for the consensus over a constitutional committee that could be a first step for a political solution. But the truth is, Syria is just one of the examples of it. Syria is a playground where many regional powers and global powers have been active in ways that, beyond the contradictions within the Syrian people itself, it has been very difficult to find a solution. And at the same time, what we are witnessing in these conflicts is that as there is no capacity to have the international community as a whole defining a solution, we see massive violations of human rights, massive violations of international humanitarian law. We have seen even that the principle of non-proliferation, for instance, of chemical weapons, has been put into question. So there is a disorder within the disorder that becomes particularly worrying, and that I hope we will be able to overcome. But it has not been easy.
You as a person had an amazing reputation for defending human rights, fighting for human rights. Yet in office, Human Rights Watch has been critical of you. They said, and they also more or less delivered the answer as well, but they said your diplomacy was very silent, especially when it came, for example, to the murder of Khashoggi or the use of chemical weapons in Syria. So why have you not heard you condemn Saudi Arabia?
No, we have been quite clear in relation to the need to detect all the truths and to have absolute accountability on that. In relation to the violations of human rights in Syria, we have been extremely active. In relation to Myanmar, let's not forget that since the 80s, there was not an official letter from the Secretary General to the Security Council raising the attention for what was a massive violation of human rights. Of course, we are not an NGO. I mean, it's notable that an NGO is even more forthcoming, because that is the role of an NGO. The role of the UN is obviously to push for the promotion of human rights, but at the same time to do everything possible in order to guarantee that our diplomatic efforts produce effects in the prevention of conflicts and in the solution of conflicts, and you need to be able to combine and to harmonize all our preoccupations. But I am quite happy with the work that the Human Rights High Commissioner is doing. I'm quite convinced that the UN as a whole represents today the most important fortress we have for the protection of human rights in the world.
How difficult is it for you to navigate all these countries who are at the same time paying for the United Nations and probably make that
It's not only a question
known?
of paying, is that we need the cooperation of countries to solve problems, to avoid wars, to save lives. And there are many difficult situations where the solution is not obvious. And that is why we need determination. We need to be faithful in relation to the principles, namely the values of the Charter. And at the same time, we need to do everything we can to reduce human suffering. I think the most important reason why I became candidate for Secretary General after having been 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees is to feel that the reduction of human suffering in the world is an absolute must.
You said you have many battles, and you do, but you also said as a grandfather your biggest battle and your biggest fight would be the fight against climate change. That sounds very, very personal. When did you discover that urgency?
Well, since long ago. I've been very strongly committed to this question because I believe it's the defining issue of our time. And climate change is running faster than what we are. I am deeply worried because what happened in Paris was very important. In Paris, there was a goal that was established, which is essential, and the international scientific community has clarified that that goal must be precise, that we cannot have more than 1.5 degrees of increase of temperature in the end of the century, and then we need to be carbon neutral in 2050 to reach that objective. But unfortunately, the commitments that were made in Paris in relation to the measures taken by the different governments around the world are not enough for that. So we need more ambition, and that is why it's so important in 2020 to have in the so-called national determined contributions much stronger commitment to mitigation, to adaptation and to finance. So we need much more than what was promised in Paris. But more dramatically, even what was promised in Paris is not being accomplished. So we are witnessing record levels in the rise of temperature, in the rise of sea levels, in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we absolutely need to reverse the present trend because things are getting worse on the ground in a dramatic way. We see with the storms that are happening, the drought that is impacting, for instance, the African continent. So this is now a matter of urgency. We are in a climate emergency. And that is why it is so important now that countries assume their responsibilities and come in the summit that we will have in September and then next year with strong commitments to guarantee carbon neutrality in 2050. And I was, of course, very happy to see the German Chancellor making that commitment last week.
Yet the American president has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord, and I'm not sure about China and other developing countries, if they are on board. What are your means and measures to actually convince them that they have to deliver?
We are in a very strong interaction with the key actors. I'm writing a letter to all members of the G20. G20 represents 80% of the emissions in the world. I was just in the Pacific. The Pacific is the most dramatically impacted, but it's not the Pacific that is creating climate change. Or the African continent, again, dramatically impacted, but it's not the African continent that is creating climate change. As I said, the G20 countries represent 80% of the emissions, and we are in dialogue with all of them, and I will be in Japan again, because it's absolutely essential. And I have to say that I found a good reception in my discussions in China when I was there recently, in my discussions in India, and these are two extremely important countries in the developing world at the present moment. I see the European Union, the Commission, presenting a proposal that, in my opinion, is extremely adequate to the situation. So there are signs of hope, even if we also have voices that still deny that climate change is a risk for not only the future generations, but I would say it's already a risk for the world today.
Not only that, they reinvest in coal plants. I mean,
one of the things I've been asking very clearly is that there should be no more coal plants built after 2020. I've been asking to shift taxation from salaries into carbon. Sometimes people ask for a tax on carbon. And people say, well, one more tax. No, what I'm asking is not for one more tax, is for to shift some of the taxes that we are now paying on salaries, on income, to shift it to we need to tax pollution, not people, as much as possible. And I'm asking for the cancellation of subsidies to fossil fuels. It does make sense to use taxpayers' money to boost hurricanes, to increase drought in several parts of the world, to melt glaciers, to bleach corals, to raise the sea levels with taxpayers' money. I mean, this doesn't make sense at all. So we can either use that money for other purposes that are much more positive, or reduce taxes. But to use taxpayers' money to boost climate change is completely irrational.
Pretty radical suggestion from your side. How open are the ears of the important people?
I've seen several governments doing it more and more. We see carbon pricing being established in different parts of the world. We see some recognizing the interest of shifting taxes to carbon. I see reduction of subsidies in some countries, not in all. And I see more and more massive investment in renewable energy. But of course, not enough. So we need a quantum leap, and that quantum leap is our main objective in the climate summit of September this year.
You started at the same day as the American president, and for you it's half time now. When you look back, when you took over, was there anything that really surprised you?
I don't think there has been many surprises. I think we face a very difficult moment. It's not surprising, it's the reality, and we need to try to change the reality and to do everything we can to make sure that the United Nations serves its purpose, which is a world based on the values of equality, justice, peace, and human dignity.
What is your hope? What will be your legacy when you leave? What is to be remembered? What would you want to have achieved?
That is something I've never been worried about. I was Prime Minister of Portugal, as I Commissioner for Refugees. I never cared about the legacy. I only care about what I'm doing. I'm trying to do the best I can, and the day I leave, I will be doing other things, as it has always happened in my life. When people start to think about their legacy, usually they start to not to do the right thing. So we need to do the right thing and then hope for the best. But I believe, yes, that it is very important that the United Nations, as such, are able to make the people of this world understand the importance of international cooperation and the importance of united efforts in a multilateral way to address the enormous challenges of the present world.
Are you going to run for a second term?
Well, this is something I do not think at all, to the sense that I will not make any concession in relation to what are the values I defend, just to create conditions to allow for a second term to exist. This is a matter that I will only think about much later. For the moment, I have to do what I have to do.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for your time, and we hope you have a safe trip to Germany eventually to receive the Karlspreis.
It will be an enormous pleasure.